Hey, everybody. Man, do we have a good show for you today. We have with us today Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who's going to give us the real inside scoop on a lot of the issues around the Ukraine-Russia war that you're not going to get anywhere else. And, the whole premise of Deep Dive is to give you some deeper understanding of what's going on behind the scenes, things that you don't, normally see when you watch TV. And this is like a great episode for that. And for those of you who may not know Ambassador Freeman, I'm going to read just a short part of his bio. And believe me, this is really short, but you're going to read this and you're hear this and you're going to think that, that no one person could have that many qualifications. And yet he does. Ambassador Freeman has previously served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Internal Security Affairs from 93 to 94, earning the highest public service awards for the Department of Defense for his roles in designing a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and reestablishing defense and military relations with China. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and served as the Deputy Chief of Charge d'Affaires of the American embassies in both Bangkok and in Beijing. And maybe most famous of all, he was a director of the Chinese affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 79 to 81, and was the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's groundbreaking visit to China in 1972. I mean, gracious, you can't hardly get any higher credibility than that, and experience. And currently, he's a visiting scholar at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Ambassador Freeman, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Other than that, I'm okay.
Listen, we just want to jump right into this. There is so much confusion on issues related to the Russia-Ukraine war, and I want to kind of zero in on a couple of them that I think are most necessary and the biggest areas of either misinformation or disinformation, however you want to look at it, in the public area. And some of this is intentional, and some of it's just by the product of news that only has 3 or 4 minutes to get your attention. But the issues I want to look at, which you gave in some detail in a speech in Rhode Island 2 days ago, where you talked about, in part of it, the origins of the war, how we got into the war, and then where we're at now. And then if we have time, I also want to talk about where we could be going next and how we might get this thing wrapped up. And in your speech, you said something that was very interesting, and I want to ask you to go a little bit further onto it. You said every government that is party to the Ukraine war, Kiev, Moscow, Washington, and other NATO capitals, has been guilty of various degrees of self-deception and blundering misfeasance. What do you mean by that? Because the way the characterization of this war is pretty straightforward. Russia bad, Ukraine good. So everything that Russia does is bad and evil, and of course NATO and Ukraine are good, but you put them all together in one lump there and said, those things are equally applicable. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that one of the big problems we have is exactly that formulation that you just voiced, the assumption that you can deduce from demonizing a party. So the confusion is not an accident. It is deliberate. Every government involved and is engaged in spewing out a fog of this is normal in war. But I don't think there's ever been an information war that's been quite as intensive as this one. If you go back and look at the origins of this, as early as 1994, Moscow, then under Boris Yeltsin, began to warn NATO and the United States that if Ukraine were incorporated into the American sphere of influence in Europe, which is NATO, the Russians would feel obliged to act militarily, react. In 2007, Vladimir Putin, the successor to Boris Yeltsin, pretty bluntly stated this at the Munich Security Conference. And yet, a year later, 2008, the United States offered, basically persuaded a lot of NATO members who were quite unsure about this, who had misgivings, to invite Ukraine, along with Georgia, to join NATO. And of course, the Russians then did take action against Georgia.
Right.
That was a signal that they were serious. Later on, 2014, when the United States sponsored a coup d'etat in Kiev and ousted the elected pro-Russian government.
Okay, actually, I want to get you to elaborate a little bit on that point there, because many people believe that this whole idea of the U.S. initiated a coup on Kiev in 2014 is like, oh, that's just Russian propaganda. Nothing like that happened. We didn't do anything like that. But you suggested actually we did at least participate in that. I wonder if you could explain a little bit, what did we actually do, and how was it fostering a coup as opposed to just something that naturally happened there?
Well, we spent a great deal of money, a lot of it through the National Endowment for Democracy, to prepare the ground for that coup. And of course, Victoria Nuland, then the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, European Affairs, and now Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, was right there in the Maidan, in the downtown area of Kiev, handing out cookies to the demonstrators. She openly, on a telephone, talked about her preferences for the successor to the incumbent president. The American ambassador was with her. It was very clear, there was no doubt at all at the time, that the United States had provoked this. And the next day, within 24 hours, the United States recognized the new government, which was anti-Russian. The first thing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole issue that was there was that there was a legally elected government that the people of Ukraine had legally and rightfully elected in there, but that he had been drifting towards Moscow. And instead of going toward the west, he had gone to Moscow. And of course, some in the west or the Western Ukraine didn't like that. And so they wanted to take some action. I guess the question is, was this an internal thing that the Western Ukrainians revolted against the government because they didn't want to move towards Moscow, or was there some help with us along the way?
Pretty clear that it was organized by us, which agency of the U.S. government actively participated in organizing that. I leave to speculation because I don't know for sure, but there's no doubt that we sponsored this. Now, the government of Poroshenko was corrupt, but it was fairly elected. So anyway, the first thing that the anti-Russian government we installed did was to outlaw the use of any minority language, including Russian, which is about a third of the Ukrainian population's native language. And I know just the other day, Orban, the leader in Hungary, said that he would, although he's a member of NATO, he would veto any further effort to aid Ukraine if the 150,000 Hungarian speakers in Ukraine were not allowed to use their own language. So this was an internal issue between Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and minorities in Ukraine. It led to the Russian annexation of Crimea, which, by the way, they accomplished with no bloodshed. They cited the precedent of our detaching Kosovo from Serbia, which was a result of a very long bombing campaign, very violent. A lot of people died. But they didn't, but they basically ran a referendum. And that referendum was the third vote in Crimea to leave Ukraine. Right after the Soviet Union broke up, Crimea tried to detach itself from Ukraine. And ultimately, the Ukrainians muscled it to the ground. The stake for the Russians, in addition to the fact that Crimea had historically been part of Russia, was that for 250 years, the main Russian naval base in the Black Sea at Sevastopol, if Crimea went into Ukraine and Ukraine went into NATO, would suddenly be under U.S. control. So this
I remember actually Putin made a comment on that when he gave his speech in 2014, that he said, we can't have our Black Sea fleet and NATO guys, however good they may be, right next door to us. So he actually cited that as his justification for doing the
Well, I think,
annexation.
the other issue here is that during the Cold War, NATO was a very clearly defensive alliance, and it helped keep peace in Europe. It was essential, really. And it did not go out of area, meaning beyond the territory of its members. But at the end of the Cold War, the phrase came in, NATO has to go out of area or out of business. The question was, what's the purpose of NATO if it doesn't have a Russian enemy anymore? And so NATO suddenly began to project power. And it did a variety of things. It did not participate in our invasion of Iraq, which was entirely illegal and unprovoked. It did participate in the pacification of Afghanistan. It participated, of course, earlier in the war with Serbia, which was not authorized by the UN and therefore was illegal under international law. And of course, it did an a la carte regime change operation in Libya. So I think when you look at this and you see that every country that joined NATO soon had an American base and American troops on its territory, you can understand how the Russians would have been kind of concerned about the proposal to bring Ukraine into NATO. Specifically, if Ukraine were in NATO and the United States did what we usually do, which is put our own troops and weaponry forward, Moscow would have had no more than 5 minutes warning of a possible decapitating missile attack. So the Russians basically were deeply concerned about this, and they made that clear.
Okay, and that actually leads into one of the other statements you made in this speech. You said Moscow wanted negotiations to avoid a war, but in their absence was prepared to go to war to remove the threats to which it objected. Washington knew this when it rejected talks with Moscow, and I presume you're referring to the December 2021 talks. The American refusal to talk was an unambiguous decision to accept the risk of war rather than exploring any compromise or accommodation with Russia. What do you think should have happened at that point, and what were the options? Could we have avoided war? Because it's being characterized that Putin on his own made this unprovoked attack. That's the common phrase. And he went in there. But it sounds like you're suggesting there actually was a way to avoid war that wouldn't have surrendered our security. What do you mean by that?
Of course. Instead of stiff-arming the Russians and saying to them, we will not discuss the European security architecture with you. We will not discuss the neutralization of Ukraine. We will not discuss keeping Ukraine out of NATO. We could have said, we're prepared to talk. When we went to the talks, we could have rejected many of the items the Russians had put on the table. Basically, they asked for the neutralization of Ukraine, which would have paralleled the Austrian State Treaty of 1956, by which at the height of the Cold War, we created a neutral state in Europe, which has prospered and become democratic. We could have said, however, that further demands like removing U.S. troops from NATO members in Eastern Europe were unacceptable. Had we begun talking, Putin would not have invaded. His objective was to get a negotiation. The purpose of the troops massed on the Ukrainian border was twofold. One, the Ukrainians, after a lot of 8 years of American and NATO training and re-equipment, had a 700,000 man army. And they had deployed that army to finally crush the Russian-speaking secessionists in Donbass. And beginning in early February, before the invasion by the Russians, the OSCE, which had team members on the ground, began to report a huge increase in ceasefire violations in the Donbass. It was very clear Ukraine was about to take an offensive. It felt ready. At that time, by the way, the Russians only had 830,000 troops on active duty. So the Ukrainian army was bigger than the British, German, and French armies put together. And it was bigger than any army in NATO except Turkey's and our own. So the Russians had one purpose, which was to deter a Ukrainian attack on the Russian-speaking areas in the east. But the other and more important one was to underscore the seriousness with which they were demanding negotiations. And when we refused to talk, not just refused to negotiate, but refused to talk, that was the final deciding moment. And I don't think Putin expected that. There's no evidence that he briefed his generals on a real plan to invade Ukraine, or that he prepared the logistics to do it, to support it, or that he told the troops what their mission was. This
wow, that's
very much like the last minute move on his part. So I'm not going to hold any, I have no brief for Putin at all, but I think the origins of this war lie in our refusal to discuss issues that were absolutely existential for the Russians.
Okay, and that into the next part of your speech, which unfortunately I'm seeing a developing trend here. After the war started, and I believe you might be referring to no, this, I'm sorry, I'm getting a couple things.
Danny, let me just say, after the war started, Turkey and Naftali Bennett, who was then the prime minister of Israel, mediated between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And they actually reached agreement on a draft treaty by which there would have been a ceasefire, there would have been a withdrawal of all heavy weapons from Donbass. Ukraine would have gotten control of the borders again. Basically, an earlier agreement, which had been reached under OSCE, German and French mediation, to give the Donbass region the same sorts of rights that Quebec has in Canada, the right to use its own language, in this case Russian, for schools and government purposes. This was repudiated by Ukraine, but there was actually a draft treaty, peace treaty drawn up. President Zelensky in Ukraine announced that he had agreed to be neutral.
And then, I remember that somewhere in the late March, the 27th, 28th, somewhere, if I remember correctly.
Late March 28, I believe. And then in early April, Boris Johnson, representing NATO and us, made a surprise visit to Kyiv and told Zelensky not to do it. He said, "You may be ready to end the war, but NATO is not."
That's unbelievable.
So this is a very sad moment, because the result of this war, whatever else it's produced, has been a mountain of dead Ukrainians.
Right. That's the biggest issue to me, is that the bill payer for all of our intransigence and unwillingness to negotiate it, and you can throw Moscow in that too, because there's a lot of intransigence there. But the biggest bill payers are the people of Ukraine and the cities of Ukraine, which is where all of this drama
and the economy and the industry.
Yeah,
some 2 to 3 million Ukrainians took refuge in Russia. Those are Russian speakers, obviously. 6, 7 million Ukrainians went west to Europe and other locations. The population of Ukraine on the eve of the war was about 31 million. It's now about 20 million. 8 million Ukrainians have been displaced within Ukraine. Ukraine is a basket case now. And with the failure of the counteroffensive, there is no real prospect that Ukraine will reemerge from this war. In fact, it could have been at peace if we had talked to the Russians, if we had not tried to block Ukraine from signing the agreement that it had tentatively agreed to under mediation by Turkey and Israel. So
this war could have been prevented from happening, and then a month into the war, it could have been stopped right then, and instead it didn't. Now that leads me to the last point that I want to talk about here, because this to me was one of the most troubling parts of your speech, and because it has direct implications for yet potentially more death and destruction in Ukraine. And you said, inasmuch as the first principle of warfare is to establish realistic objectives, a strategy to achieve them, and a plan for war termination. This is the perfect description of how to brew up a forever war, as in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen attest to this. This has become the established American way of war. No clear objectives, no plan to achieve them, no concept of how to end the war, on what terms, and with whom. Now, if that has characterized our wars of the past, and we have the most vivid recent example of Afghanistan still fresh, if that's the case now, how does this war end if we're not willing to talk and we don't even know what we're trying to accomplish? What do you see, say, in the next 6 months off the battlefield and on it?
Well, I take our president, Joe Biden, seriously. At the UN General Assembly, he opposed peace talks with Russia on the grounds that this would somehow reward Russia for its aggression. And it's very clearly what Russia did was illegal. It was aggression. There's no question about that. The only issue was what was the provocation and could it have been stopped? Now, I don't see an easy end to the war. Certainly the United States, and for that matter, Russia, seem determined to persist in destroying Ukraine. There's a good chance that Ukraine will lose still more territory. The last recruitment drive the Ukrainians did came in at about 15% of the target.
15%?
15%.
Yikes.
The Russians claim that they recently captured a Ukrainian tank crew in which there was a 73-year-old guy who had been drafted and given no training at all. You got to hand it to the Ukrainians. They are amazingly courageous, brave people. But, you know, bravery on the battlefield is not enough to counter firepower and strategic depth. And the Russians have both. So I think this is tragic. And the likely outcome at some point is going to be a change of government in Kyiv and suing for peace. And Ukraine's bargaining position has been gravely weakened by everything that's happened. We'll be lucky to get over that line. And then the question is, how many Ukrainians are left? What does Ukraine consist of? And if we want to rebuild Ukraine, I think there are some clear ways that has to happen. First of all, Ukraine's got to create conditions where the refugees come home. Most of them don't seem to want to come home at this point, given what's happened. And
who can blame them with the war still hot? I mean, where would they even go?
They're living in Poland and France and Germany and UK and other places, and life is better than in Ukraine. Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe. It still is. It was the poorest country in Europe. It's even poorer now. So I think Ukraine has to be, whatever's left of Ukraine is going to have to be brought into the EU, the European Union, integrated into Europe, not into NATO. It's going to have to be neutral.
Yeah.
Which, you know, basically all of this war is going to end up producing exactly what we refused to consider at the outset, namely protecting Ukraine by making it neutral, a buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia, a bridge between the rest of Europe and Russia. That's what should have happened. But
that deal was available.
We don't know how
available afterwards, and now it'll eventually be that way, but at a catastrophic cost, much higher than if they had done it earlier.
Absolutely, and that is the definition of a tragedy. Now, I think the excerpt from the talk that you read about what's required to make a successful war. Purpose of war is to create a better peace. This war is not going to do that. This war is going to produce misery for whatever's left of Ukraine. It also, by the way, our stated objective had nothing to do with Ukraine and protecting it. It was, quote, to isolate and weaken Russia. That's what the president said. That's what Secretary of Defense said.
Yeah.
It has not succeeded at doing either. It has removed Western influence from Russia, yes. Russia's now looking to China, India, the Middle East, and Africa for its international support. It has not weakened Russia. The Russian defense budget when this war began was about $58 billion. That same year, 2022, we appropriated $113 billion in aid to Ukraine. Russia is now producing 12 times the ammunition it did on the eve of the war. The economy has not faltered. Russia, if you look at it in terms of purchasing power, which is the approved usual way to measure relative size of economies internationally, Russia has grown to outdo Germany in size. By the way, the war has
with all the sanctions we put in, yet they're actually growing. And I would wager that Germany has shrunk. Is that not correct?
Germany has been devastated by the sanctions, not by the war. The sanctions that we put on cut Germany off Russian energy. This is without getting into who blew up Nord Stream, which I'm pretty much convinced we did.
Yeah.
The fact is that the German industry is no longer competitive because energy prices are now vastly higher than they were before. So we've ruined Germany economically. We've ruined Ukraine. We have not ruined Russia. Russia now has the 5th largest economy on the planet. You can say Mr. Putin is a ruthless, nasty son of a bitch, and I'll agree with you. But we've put him in a position that is, in many respects, enviable. And that was not what we set out to do.
It's not, and I think it's certainly arguable that we have now made the West and Ukraine in a more vulnerable position, and there's no negotiating leverage we have over Putin. He could just say, we're just going to continue to let things roll until you collapse. But unless we are finally willing to say, hey, this is a bad place and it's going someplace worse, we need to get the best deal we can get now, it's going to get a lot worse. I don't see any prospect that it gets better. Do you?
You know, there's something we should have learned from Afghanistan, and that is never reinforce strategic failure.
Should have learned.
We should have learned that lesson. I think we have seen a temporary boost to NATO unity during this war. Europeans have finally come to the grips with the fact that they have to defend themselves before looking to the United States, and they're actually going to meet the 2% GDP spending target on defense now. In a way, that's hedging against us as well as against a Russian attack. By the way, the Russians have discredited themselves on the battlefield. You know, there's no way they can take Europe. They can't even take Ukraine. I mean, they have learned a lot. We have given them the best education we possibly could in how to counter modern Western weaponry.
I know.
They have become stronger, not weaker. But you know, there are a couple of things here that we need to think about. In Ukraine, Mr. Putin began. It's a very common Russian view that Ukrainians are really just Russians in disguise. They're kind of, they speak a peasant dialect called Ukrainian, but they're really Russians. And all this, Russians and Ukrainians are brothers. And he had this theory, as is taught in the Russian schools. And what he's done is create a Ukrainian nationalism that is fierce and fiercely anti-Russian and is not going to go away. Ukrainians are deeply embittered about Russia, and they have to learn to live with Russia because it's their neighbor. But that's going to be incredibly difficult.
Right, and especially with whatever kind of negotiated settlement eventually does this, it's definitely not going to be beneficial to Ukraine, which will only further embitter all those who are left. And that's unfortunately, I think inescapable at this point.
But nobody ever bothers to ask people on the ground what identity they want. You know, it's 75% of Crimea is Russian speaking. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. The Donbass is majority Russian speaking in part. So the other thing that's happened is the Russian speakers have had their Russian identity reinforced. So we started out with a civil war, which began in 2014 and ended in 2022 with a proxy war between the US and Russia, which is still going on. That civil war has divided Ukraine. It's been partitioned. It's not going to come back together.
It's never going to come back. Yeah.
So whatever the Russians do, it's not going to come back together. And we've just seen in Nagorno-Karabakh the example of the Armenians embittered by warfare with the Azeris fleeing to Armenia. Of course, people don't remember that originally Armenia expelled the Azeris who lived there, and they're still camped on the mud flats outside Baku.
Which just goes to underscore your point there that this is, even when this gets a negotiated settlement, this is something that's not going to produce an enduring peace. We're going to have these difficulties for a long time, which is another reason never to give NATO membership to Ukraine. Well, we're going to have to leave it there right now because we're out of time here. But I'm so grateful, Ambassador Freeman, for your time here. And boy, this was probably the best deep dive we've ever had on the subject. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.